Welcome back to the Aromatic Mystery School. I'm Elizabeth Ashley, the Secret Healer, and I am really excited today to talk to one of my favourite people in the world, Rowan Seegars, about a course that we are going to be doing in June. And the original premise of the course was about using essential oils to make devotions for a goddess. And because Rowan knows so much about Hecate, we decided that we would do the goddess Hecate. So, say hello, Rowan.
Hi, Liz. I'm so excited to be here with you. Thank you so much. And super excited to be talking about Hecate. As you know, I can talk for hours about her on end. So anything that we can do to sort of bring a new perspective or like a new practice into people's work with her, I'm really excited to start talking about.
Absolutely. So, tell us a bit about your background of working with Hecate, first of all, because she's perhaps not, she's a goddess that maybe some people are afraid of. So, perhaps we could address it from that point of view.
Yeah, so let's see, where did my journey with her start? I guess when I was 14, 15, really was the first time that I kind of heard her name or saw it in a book. And it was, in one of those like old school kind of correspondence lists of like, she is the goddess of the moon and witchcraft, and Athena is the goddess of wisdom. And there was just something in that that immediately sort of resonated. But I said, I'm not doing that right now. I'm really focused on Egypt and this Egyptian goddess and the cats and bust and these like perfume dances. So over the next few years, that kind of evolved as I met more devotees and practitioners in the community. And my relationship with her kind of grew organically and a little bit inorganically. She kind of made her presence in my life a little more physically and forcefully known and started kind of hedging out everything else. Um, in ways that were kind of undeniable, like, just things that let me know, okay, yeah, no, this is what we're doing. And I think that's fairly common amongst practitioners and devotees of Hecate that she kind of comes and establishes herself. Um, when I started back in the early 2000s, there was still kind of this vague aura around Hecate, like you said, of like, oh, she's a dark goddess, or she's like wooky spooky and like, kind of not to be trifled with. And I think you could say that about any of the gods, honestly. I don't think that trifling with the gods is the best idea. But over the last 20 years, I've seen a big shift in the way that people perceive her as we're getting more information from historic sources, from ancient writers, and from our own personal gnosis that kind of bring out these other aspects that she's not just death and ghosts and like cursed tablets found in bogs. She's also Kourotrophos, the nursemaid and the nurturer. She's also the tender-hearted, the bright coiffed, all of these other things that we don't necessarily immediately think of when we think of Hecate. And so
Yeah.
obviously that's something that we want to bring forward in this course as we're talking about these different epithets and these different I guess approaches to the singular personality that is Hecate.
Yeah, for sure. So the people who perhaps don't know much about Hellenism or goddess practice as a whole, perhaps we should explain what we mean by the word epithets.
Yes. So epithets is a fancy way of saying names or titles. You find this really quite cross-culturally, where you'll have these different appellations to different gods that are kind of either descriptors of their job in a certain role or praise titles that recall a certain aspect of mythology. So with Hecate, if you look at the Orphic hymns, for example, which were written in the second or third century CE, so relatively late in her worship, but these are excellent examples because the whole hymn is basically a list of these names. So they call her the earthly one, Chthoniya, or the heavenly one, Urania. They call her Krokopeplos, the saffron clad, Vasilia or Anasa, which means queen. Kourotrophos, the key bearer. So these are all ways of kind of getting around naming them directly. You wouldn't just say, Hecate, I call you to this right, or Hecate is closer to the actual Greek pronunciation. Hecate, I call you to this right. You would say, I call you beautiful one, tender-hearted, nurse of mankind, leader of Persephone, who wanders the underworld, queen of ghosts and spirits, who delights in deer and dogs. So you're kind of building a mental and energetic profile in your own ritual space as you're calling out these different names. And while they aren't necessarily different deities, like Hecate of the underworld is not a different goddess to Hecate of the ocean. Sometimes they are, right? Because there was no such thing as Greek religion, as we might think of like the Orthodox Church in Greece now. It was kind of a smattering of loosely cohesive ideas that cropped up in different places across the Hellenic world. So
Yeah, but we can perhaps expand on that as well. That the ancient Greeks didn't separate, didn't really have a religion as such, because they didn't separate it from anything else. It was wound in with civic stuff. It was wound in with political stuff. So it was believed that the gods and goddesses were everywhere, all of the time, always with you. So as you say, so as you go to different places, you'll see different manifestations of the deity. I was thinking about this from a point of view, from an Egyptian point of view, actually. I was thinking about how people go to Luxor Temple to visit the goddess Sekhmet. And she is a fearful goddess. You know, she's a lion goddess. She is a goddess of medicine, but also pestilence and plague. She's bringer of all disease. When people go into the room with her, into the temple with her at Luxor, everybody comes out saying she had such a benign presence. Very clearly, that manifestation in that temple is not the goddess of disease. She's not the war goddess, even though that is who Sekhmet is. That's not the vibration that she's giving off. And I think that's part of what we wanted to do with this course that we're thinking of, well, that we've written, was to create a receptacle where people could design how their statue felt. So have you got your statue there, Rowan?
I have a little selection of statues
Oh,
here.
have you?
So I'm going to start with my favorite. It's a plaque that's a reproduction of a Roman, I think, era, like, again, 2nd or 3rd century CE, where you can see her in triplicate, the triple forms, holding the torches. She's got the patera, which is like a plate, and the amphora, like a libation offering base. And on her head, she has the polis crown, which I'm very into learning the iconography and like, why is she depicted with this crown over this one? And what does this mean? And why is she holding this? This is a reproduction done by a very good friend of mine in Brazil, who's an amazing artist. And it's because he's also a devotee. And I know that he made this by hand. It's sort of, and he was the one that made the decisions about painting it. It feels already sort of ensouled to me versus, and this is not to knock any statues or any images at all, but then we have this one, which is, again, sort of follows a classical depiction of the triple form, which we can kind of see her evolution in ancient Greece. Pausanias says that it was this sculptor Alcamenes in the 5th century who first depicted her in triplicate. Before that, she was single-bodied. And she's got her, torches and snake and the knife and key and some of these traditional things that she would be holding. And this one's just polyresin that kind of came off the factory and like off the shelf, and it doesn't have that same essence already built into it. So I think that that's where a course like this gets really important, in my opinion, is how do you make it something that has an essence. And it's a little strange. I was thinking about this earlier. So like here, again, there's like a little more historic, obviously still the same like kind of polyresin stuff. But this one was given to me at the Temple of Hecate in Lagina by a priestess of Hecate, and we did a little ritual. So, you know, there's like varying levels of how sacred I feel something is. So I think in a lot of the modern pagan and polytheist movements, we've kind of had a history of defining ourselves against something or defining ourselves by what we don't do because of a sort of history of persecution or a fear of perception. So when you hear things like, oh, they worship statues or they pray to idols, there's been this movement to say, well, we don't, no, we don't do that at all. We just use the statues symbolically to represent the idea of a god in the same way that you might find a cross in a Baptist church or a crucifix in a Catholic church. And while that's true, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that, I don't think that that's accurate to the way that practices were held in the ancient world. And a lot of this comes from my experience in Hinduism. I started studying and practicing Hinduism when I was 17, alongside all of these other things. And when you go into a Hindu temple, they, first of all, there are certain rituals to invoke the essence of the god into the statue. So of course, we're not worshiping the statue. That's crazy. Who would do that? But we are worshiping the god through the vehicle of a statue as a way that they can be embodied and sort of placed into our physical reality. So you go in and they are draping the statues in fabrics and they're bathing them and they're putting these scented like sandalwood and, you know, jewelry and flowers and all of these things. And it creates an essence where you feel like you've come into the presence of the goddess or the whichever deity. That's why they call it, the word darshan means like the viewing, the vision, the presence of the deity. So like whenever they pull back the curtains, you get a sense that you are actually looking on the mysteries of this goddess or this deity because it's been worshipped as a vehicle through which she can come to you. So it's kind of like saying, I'm not really talking to you right now. I'm talking to a computer, but I'm not talking to the computer. I'm talking to you. We're interacting through the medium of the computer. Again, I could sort of ramble about this. It's very dear to my heart, but you know, that sort of encapsulates, I think, what I'm hoping to bring out of this class that we're teaching.
That was so not rambling. It was beautifully put. And while we were sort of sketching out what we wanted to do, a really fascinating paper was released from the University of Copenhagen into the research of using oils on statues in ancient Greece. So the course that we're going to do is broken down into 5 parts, 5 different lessons. And the first one is really my classical studies research and the work that I've done on this paper from Copenhagen, talking about the different research into how oils were used on statues, why they were used on statues, what other aromatics were used, how were they prepared, why were they prepared that way. And it's really fascinating, actually. And it really brought to life when I was doing the Melissa work of trying to understand what the priestess was doing. And that idea of, well, it was her job to draw back the curtains really was made beautiful then by Rowan saying how she was prepared, she was scented, that you would move the curtains back and suddenly you would be presented with this incredible scent of this goddess. So that's the first part, and then we'll be looking at 3 different epithets. Which, do you want to talk through those?
Sure. Yeah. So the 3 epithets that we've chosen to work with are kind of going to give us an overview of, um, I like to think of it as sort of the arc of life. So we'll start with Kourotrophos. The name means the nursemaid, from Kouros, child, and Trophe, the nurse. And this is an aspect of Hecate where she is very involved in labor and birthing, in the overseeing of the protection and raising of children, but also in a broader sense, how we kind of nurture and are nurtured by the gods throughout our lives. And then let's see, the third class that we'll do is on Hecate Krokopeplos, which means the saffron clad. The peplos is kind of this very common classical garment that's belted and ruffled here. And this is not an epithet that has a ton of historical information. It's something that we're kind of learning through a broader study of symbolism and this understanding of iconography and like how we might put that together. So to me, Krokopeplos is the embodiment of the sun and the nobility and regality of life and sort of all the vivaciousness that comes with that. And then the last epithet that we'll be looking at is Tymbidia, who the name means like sepulchral or tomb-like, tomb-wandering, from the word tumbos in ancient Greek. Because, you know, it's as much as it does kind of tie into the old ideas of her being like the wooky, spooky spirit goddess, that's actually very accurate to a lot of her mythology. I'm so sorry, my cats are freaking out right now. They get very excited about Hecate. So in the tomb wandering, not only is she connected to the kind of wandering spirits of the dead, and both, like you said, with Sekhmet, uh, um, the way that she can call and send spirits toward people, but also apatropaically protect us from their influence. But she also takes on this role later in Orphic and Chaldean sort of theologies, where she has a role of um, escorting and liberating and transforming the soul. And I think that those are two very different aspects intrinsically tied to that nature. So I think it's going to be exciting looking at how there's kind of the necromantic tradition, if you will, and then if you want to say theurgic or like henosis-based tradition.
You chickened out. Come on, what's her full name? Not Tymbidia. Do it.
Oh, yes. Okay, so this name comes from the Orphic hymns, actually. And in the Orphic hymns, they say, Tymbidion psyches nechion metavacheusan. So Tymbidion, the grammar here, I think it's in the accusative case. So some of the words, instead of Tymbidia, becomes Tymbidion. Although don't quote me on that. My concept of English grammar is sometimes not the best. So when we get into some of the foreign territory, you know, I could be wrong. I'm usually not, but I could be. So Tymbidia means of the tombs. Psyches nechion is like the souls of the dead. Psyche, like psyche, you know, the soul. And then nechion, like necropolis or necromancy, has the same root. So the sepulchral one of the souls of the dead, Timidion Psyches nechion, metavacheusan, like who celebrates the rites of Bacchus, Dionysus, obviously, who is a central figure in the Orphic theology and the Orphic mystery cult, which gets a little bit further afield from what we think of as like classical Greek religion, again, which there wasn't one monolithic thing. But in these mystery cults, the idea tends to focus more on the liberation of the soul or the perpetuation of the soul after death, not just in this sort of dusty fields of asphodel, but as a I guess, a merging with the gods. And so when in the Orphic rites, she's said to be dancing with the souls of the dead among the tombs and celebrating these Bacchic rites, it's kind of an allusion to the fact that she helps us achieve this merging with the divine oversoul that is Dionysus in these in these mysteries, which gets a
So
little
fascinating.
far afield,
Yeah, it is really fascinating though, and I really thought a lot about it while we've been doing the work about how somebody was a devotee of Hecate, that she may want to put a statue of Kourotrophos in the nursery with her child, and so would she want the aspect of Hecate that dances with the tombs in the nursery? I don't think she would. So this is really fascinating, like honing it to really honing your intention that you're putting into the statue. And we'll also be using the blends that we make to look at amulets and talismans as well. I think the most interesting thing about this is if you look up like plants that are devotional to Hecate, what you are going to find is poisonous plants. And she's goddess of witchcraft, and so those don't really find their way into essential oils. So you might be looking at monk's hood or deadly nightshade, but you're not going to be able to use those as oils, and you certainly wouldn't want those to be in the nursery with a child. So it's a completely new way of doing it, of really thinking about the feeling of the goddess in the same way of how do essential oils make you feel, how does the goddess feel, and bringing that together. And then so we've talked about 4 classes. We're talking about the history of the treatment of the statues and a bit about Hecate. We've talked about the 3 epithets, and then on the 5th class, what we'll do is saying, well, which was the favorite one to you? Which one would you like to make your own blend? And we'll be doing that with all sorts of prayers and chants and lovely music, and creating our blends in a ritual space. So I think I'm really looking forward to it. What aspects are you looking forward to it most?
My personal dedication is first and foremost to Hecate Krokopeplos. Um, she's, like I said earlier, they're not all separate goddesses, but they do all have a separate flavor, kind of like you are different to like when you're at home with your husband to when you're at home with your mom versus when you're here with me. You're the same person, but you're giving off a different persona or presence. So to me, she's the one that really has had the most influence and impact on my life. But I think I'm also really excited about talking about Kourotrophos because I think it's something that kind of gets overlooked with Hecate, even though it's a very um, prominent aspect. That name also comes from the Orphic hymns, but we also find it in Hesiod's Theogony, the earliest writings that we have documenting the goddess Hecate, where he says that Zeus made her the nurse of humanity. So it's a thread that has carried throughout all of her worship and also ties her to all of these other goddesses like Artemis and Alethea, Rhea and Cybele. But we don't really hear that much about, like, nobody's really, I won't say nobody, but most people aren't really putting statues of Hecate in their nursery. That's not what they think of. So I like approaching the goddess from sort of underexplored lenses.
Yeah, it really struck me when we were chatting the first week about thinking about the vulnerable state that women were in at the time, and how many miscarriages they're suspected to have had, and how young they were when they had their babies, and how disenfranchised the women were, and it really brought the goddess to life. Really, I really thought I can see why she was beloved, because they must have felt very on their own. So we'll be talking quite a lot about that in the first workshop too. So is there anything else that you would like to say about it?
I want to say so many things.
Do it.
No, I think we've kind of covered it. I'm really looking forward to this. What I'm hoping that people get out of this is a way to, not only with Hecate, but with any deity that they feel close to, or any practice or principle that they feel close to find a way to bring that more fully and sort of, as a priestess friend of mine likes to say, instantiated into their life so that, of course, the gods are with us all the time, but when you walk into a space, you get this sense of like, I have entered the Garbhagriha, to use a term from Hinduism, or the Sanctum Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies. I've entered a sacred presence. And I think that that shift really changes and starts to develop and flesh out our worldview as pagans or polytheists or animists. And it sort of gives us a more tangible sense of like, oh yeah, this isn't something that happens in a temple, which is a little bit, of an oxymoron, that you have to go to this one statue or go to this temple to get the sense. But once you have it, I think it carries out into the world further, because you have the scent profile, and maybe you use rose and myrtle and hyacinth to anoint your statue of Aphrodite. And then you're walking through a rose garden one day and you go, oh, she's here. I can feel her. I have this sense memory, and and can say a lot more about it than I can. But the scent is, our strongest memory connector to things. And so, yeah, I think I'm just really excited. And I've not done anything like this in the past. So I'm very excited to be working with you on this.
I think it's really new ground, isn't it? And I'm really, well, I'm so grateful that you said that you wanted to do it as well, because she's not really a goddess that I work with. She obviously turns up in Melissa work in that she appears in the Demeter story, but outside of that, haven't really encountered her. So I'm really looking forward to getting to know her in a different way. So the course begins on the 4th of June, and I shall put all of the details in the description below. And I really hope that we'll see you then. Bye bye.